So let's go over a little bit more about the linguistic variations across dialects. Here is an example of the phonological differences, and these phonological differences aren't random. They're actually rules governing and sort of patterns in the ways in which the sounds are distributed across the dialect. So in New England, the rule is actually that R's are dropped, especially at the end of words, like car would be ka, right? An extra R is added to words that end with a vowel, so Cuba would be Cuber. And also there is no distinction between these two words, and so I actually say them differently. I go dawn and dawn, but actually in New England, the New England dialect, they would say dawn and dawn. Okay, in metropolitan New York, the rule is that when an R comes after a vowel, it's often dropped. So beer would be beer. In the sounds like in third, becomes the sound oi. So and that's very particular to one of the dialects that are spoken in New York. So third is thoid. And then th, that hard the, right, that voiced the sound becomes replaced with a d, right? So this becomes dis, or these become d's. And so just notice how there are rules governing that change in phonology. Okay, it's not just random. In terms of lexical differences, I'll show you this difference between the dialect boundaries in the US. So in the South, a skillet, they would say skillet. In the North, it becomes a frying pan. In New England, they would say spider. And in the Midland, they say skillet. A gutter in the South is an eaves trough in the North, is a gutter in New England, is a rain spouting in mid-Atlantic. The seesaw in the South is a dandle in New England, or a teeter-totter in the North, the Mid-Atlantic, the Midland, and the West. Morphological. So the Southern United States dialect has, I knowed you for a fool soon as I seen you. So we know that in Standard American English, the past tense of know would be knew, right? We don't add that ed. But in that dialect, they don't have that rule. They actually have the ed added on to that verb too. So it becomes I knowed you for a fool. And that's a morphological difference. A syntactical difference, this is taken from the Pennsylvania Dutch English dialect. So they would say, you, a piece of cake, should cut yourself before you go. We know that in Standard American English we would say, you should cut yourself a piece of cake before you go. And so here we see the subject, object, and verb, should cut. So you being the subject, a piece of cake being the object, and then should cut being the verb. And so it's SOV, order. And notice how, because we're talking about word order, that's why it's an example of a syntactical difference between dialects. Okay, obviously in Standard American English, we would say you should cut yourself a piece of cake, which would be subject, verb, object. Okay, so now we're going to get to our first activity, and what I'd like you to do, this activity sheet is available in the unit where you're watching this video. I have given you some examples of dialects from, actually 10 different examples of different dialects. What I want you to do, normally in a classroom you would do this with a partner, but obviously you're going to be on your own. So take a look at these examples and compare them with the Standard American English that is listed below. Okay, so I've given you sort of, in other words, a translation of what that phrase would be in Standard American English, and I want you to figure out if you see a phonological difference, a morphological difference, a lexical or vocabulary difference, or a syntactical difference. Okay, and we're going to go over this in a second. If you would like to pause your video right now, it'll give you some time to for you to complete the worksheet, and then we'll go over it together. Okay, so let's go over it. Here's basically the activity sheet that you should be working with. The first example is the Southern US dialect. It says, I'm fixin' to go to the store. And actually, I will change this as we speak. So there is a lexical difference between the two and a phonological difference. The lexical is that I'm fixing. Fixing is actually taking the place of getting ready, right? So it's a vocabulary difference. And then it's phonological too because the G is missing at the end. And so they actually say fixin' rather than fixing, and that's a phonological rule that they drop the G in the ing words. The next one, howdy, how y'all doing? Here you would have lexical, syntactical, and phonological difference. Lexical in howdy. Howdy becomes the replacement to hello, so it's a vocabulary difference. Y'all, meaning you all, and then doing. So it's syntactical because you all is the be equal to like plural you, so a group of people that you're saying you to. And the way that in the Southern US dialect they notify that is that they put all. So when you say you versus you all, there's a difference in the number of people that this person speaking Southern US dialect would be referring to. In that you all statement, they're referring to a number of different people, and so it's a syntactical difference because they have to add the all, right? And then phonological because, again, notice how that doing doesn't have the G, right? It's doing like fixin', and so that's phonological difference too. Okay, I'm going down, so I guess on number 5 is lexical, right? It's twixt the shop and the park, twixt being the replacement of between. Pennsylvania Dutch, go out and tie the dog loose. This is both a lexical and a syntactical difference from Standard American English. The first, lexical, being that tie loose is now taking the place of untie. So in Standard American English we use one word, untie. In this example from Southern US dialect, from the Pennsylvania Dutch dialect, they're using tie and loose instead, right? So it's a lexical difference. It's syntactically different in that the object, the dog, actually goes between that verb phrase, right? That tie loose. So it's tie the dog loose rather than tie loose the dog. So it's a syntactical difference as well. New England, stop hunning the water. So hunning is a replacement to hogging, so we know that that's lexical. And then they would say water, something to that effect. But we can hear it's a phonological difference. Okay. Here we have lexical. There's actually 2 lexical differences. Grandmom for grandma, and then wonderful for very. This is also lexical because piggies is the way that they would say toes. Tubby is the way that they would say bath for the next one. Here also mash is the way that they would say push. And then the last one is both of these examples are phonological. So gimme instead of give me, and then fork instead of fork. So phonological. Okay, so now we're going to talk about African American English vernacular and sort of shift our perspective to this dialect in particular. I'm going to show you a little clip that is only about 1 minute and 35 seconds. And it's from another well-known video about dialects, and it's talking about specifically linguistic discrimination in the classroom with regards to African American English vernacular, or the dialect that many African Americans speak in the United States.
When rural Southern blacks eventually moved to the cities of the North, they brought their own kind of English with them. They're young men now, but 25 years ago, Dwayne, Asheen, and Thiele were students at this school. Situated in a prosperous, mostly white suburb of Ann Arbor, there were not many black kids at the Martin Luther King School. When they spoke, as they did at home, in African American English, their teachers simply assumed they couldn't do schoolwork.
It sort of felt like we were unteachable in a sense, I would feel. So it kind of made them go towards other students more and gave them a little bit more help than they would give us.
Can you remember some of the things that were said, teachers would say?
Actually, to be honest, the teachers really didn't even communicate with us too much. It just was sort of like, in the sense that we were on our own.
Do you remember any of that? You were younger.
I was real young, but I mean, I remember enough to know that I wasn't being treated the same way as all the other kids in the class, or a lot of the other kids. You know, that's the irony of it all. It's Martin Luther King school, and, you know, they haven't learned anything from Martin Luther King. Well, hopefully they learned it, but they didn't learn it back then.
3 mothers refused to accept second best for their sons.
Okay. So, in addition to the video, I'm going to show you a couple of speech bubbles that represent some of the things that are said by African American children about their dialect, African American English vernacular, in school. This comes from an article that I used to have students read, but I really want to focus in on just some of these clips. Okay, so I'm going to read them for you. And again, just remember, these are students describing how they were made to feel about their dialect in school by teachers. Instead of showing me how speakers of Ebonics, and Ebonics is another word for African American English vernacular, sometimes use both a name and a pronoun, but in standard English only one is used, I got marked wrong. Kids have been taught that the way they speak is wrong their entire lives. They brainwashed me at school to be ashamed of my language, and that almost took away one of the few things that African Americans had of our past life and history. Ebonics was vilified as disgusting black street slang, as incorrect and substandard, as nothing more than ignorance, as the language of illiteracy, as this utmost ridiculous made-up language. So, from the clip that you saw, where the now adults were discussing how they were made to feel in the classroom because of who they were, because they were African American, and also because of the dialect they spoke. You can see that there's obviously prejudice about the African American English vernacular dialect in society, and prejudice around African Americans. And there's this idea that there's a correct form of speech, and because these students come in with a different dialect, that they either are seen as incapable, or their value is seen as less. So students who are told that their dialect is incorrect or wrong form an identity crisis, because if you realize the language that we speak, the dialect that we own, really is very closely connected to our idea of ourselves, right? Our identity, the sort of the culture that we consider ourselves to be an insider from. And so language and identity really cannot be separated. The way that we speak is very closely tied to how we see ourselves and what we value about ourselves. And so this is why these adults as children felt ashamed of their language and consequently of themselves. And this is why these students, as you can see from these speech bubbles here, are feeling as if they were brainwashed, or they were getting marked wrong unnecessarily, or they were seen as illiterate or ignorant or substandard. Okay, this is why it is so important for teachers to understand that dialects are no more grammatical than one another. The only difference is that now, based on society, there are certain dialects that are expected to be spoken in particular contexts. And not that somebody who comes in speaking another dialect has anything wrong or is doing anything incorrectly, but it's just the way in which the community that they come from speaks. Okay. So, educational discrimination happens all the time in the classroom due to the way that students who are from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds speak. So this is not only just about English language learners who speak, for example, Chicano English, but it's also about students who speak English as their native language, but are speaking the dialects that are not represented in the classroom. Okay, and because this is in society associated with a negative stereotype and negative misconceptions, it's really important for you as teachers to understand the difference and not to view it in a deficit way. Okay, so we're going to address these issues and talk about the severity of these judgments and the stereotypes, and we're also going to look at the systematic organization of African American English vernacular. Before we get into that, we're going to talk about pidgins and creoles, because it actually has a lot to do with the development of African American English vernacular and the history of language in this country.